Pitch-black floodwaters swallowed the coastal highway whole. Most men run from a Category 4 hurricane, but Chief Colin Hayes ran toward it. Beside him wasn't a squad of heavily armed operators, but a 70-pound Belgian Malinois named Kodiak. What they found inside that submerged house completely defied logic. It was September, and the humid air off the coast of South Carolina tasted of salt and impending violence. Chief Petty Officer Colin Hayes of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group was supposed to be on medical leave. 6 months prior, a shrapnel wound in the Arghandab River Valley had torn through his left shoulder, earning him a Purple Heart, a titanium plate, and a mandatory rotation back stateside. He hadn't returned alone. Sitting at his feet on the porch of his isolated cabin in Mount Pleasant was Kodiak, a multi-purpose K9 MPC who had served 3 combat deployments. Kodiak was a Belgian Malinois with a coat the color of burnt mahogany eyes, like chipped amber, and a titanium upper canine tooth, a permanent souvenir from a close-quarters breach in Helmand Province. The dog wasn't just a pet. He was a highly trained weapon, a tracker, and most importantly to Colin, the only entity on Earth who knew how to wake him up from his night terrors without getting punched. The local news had been warning about Hurricane Selene for a week, but storms in the Atlantic were notoriously fickle. Meteorologists predicted a sudden turn north, sparing the Charleston area from the worst. They were catastrophically wrong. By 8 p.m. on a Tuesday, the barometric pressure plummeted so fast, Colin felt it in his teeth. The sky turned a bruised, sickly purple, and the wind began to howl, not a whistle, but a deep, guttural roar that sounded terrifyingly like an incoming artillery shell. Colin was boarding up his final window when the local emergency scanner crackled to life on his kitchen counter. It was Sheriff's Deputy Wade Dempsey, his voice barely audible over the static and the screaming wind. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I can't get down Cooper's Point Road. The surge is already at 5 feet and rising fast. The bridge is completely gone." A beat of static followed before the dispatcher replied, her voice tight with panic. "Unit 4, we have a 911 relay from the Gallagher residence at the end of the point. Fiona Gallagher and her 2 young children are trapped in the attic. Water is breaching their 2nd floor. Coast Guard assets are grounded due to wind shear." "Can you make it on foot?" "Negative dispatch," Wade shouted. "The current is sweeping cars away. It's suicide." Colin stopped hammering. He knew Cooper's Point. It was a low-lying spit of marshland that jutted out into the bay, entirely exposed to the ocean's fury. He also knew Fiona Gallagher. She was a pediatric nurse who had helped him navigate the labyrinth of the VA hospital pharmacy a few months prior. Her husband was a long-haul trucker, currently stranded on Interstate 95 hundreds of miles away. Fiona and her kids, 7-year-old Leo and 4-year-old Maya, were out there alone in the dark. Colin looked down at Kodiak. The Malinois was already standing, his ears pinned forward, muscles coiled tight beneath his fur. He sensed the shift in Colin's adrenaline. "We're not Coast Guard, buddy," Colin muttered, throwing his hammer onto the kitchen table. "But we're not staying here." Within 3 minutes, Colin was geared up. He bypassed his heavy plate carriers and opted for a swift water rescue harness, a waterproof tactical flashlight, 50 feet of high-tensile paracord, and a heavy-duty carabiner. He strapped a specialized buoyant K9 flotation vest onto Kodiak. The dog stepped into it smoothly, familiar with the ritual of gearing up for a mission, even if the enemy tonight was water rather than insurgents. They piled into Colin's modified heavy-duty truck. The drive toward Cooper's Point was a descent into a nightmare. Trees were bent completely sideways, their root systems groaning under the strain. Sheet metal from torn roofs flew through the air like guillotines. When they finally reached the barricade where Wade Dempsey had parked his cruiser, The water was already lapping at Colin's floorboards. Wade, drenched and frantic, shined his flashlight at Colin's truck as he stepped out. "Hayes, what the hell are you doing out here? You can't go down there. The road is a river. Fiona Gallagher is down that road." Wade, Colin yelled over the roaring wind, hooking Kodiak's lead to his belt. "You'll drown," Wade screamed back, holding onto his doorframe to keep from being blown over. "The current is pulling straight out into the Atlantic." Colin knelt down, looking Kodiak dead in the eyes. In combat, dogs are trained to track scent-detect explosives and apprehend combatants. But Malinois are also incredibly strong swimmers, possessing a drive and tenacity that defies natural self-preservation. "Ready to work, Cody?" Colin asked. Kodiak let out a sharp, affirmative bark that cut through the thunder. Colin stood up, looking at the deputy. "If we're not back in 2 hours, tell the brass I went out fighting." Without waiting for a response, Colin and Kodiak plunged off the elevated asphalt and into the churning black floodwaters of Cooper's Point. The cold hit Colin like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. The water was a chaotic soup of mud, shattered pine branches, fiberglass insulation, and gasoline. It was only waist-deep initially, but the current was ferocious, trying to sweep his legs out from under him with every step. Beside him, Kodiak paddled fiercely. The dog's flotation vest kept his head above the chop, but his powerful legs were doing the real work. Colin unclipped the short lead, giving the dog more freedom to maneuver through the floating debris. "Find 'em, Cody Such," Colin commanded, using the Dutch word for search. Tracking scent in a hurricane was theoretically impossible. The wind and rain should have obliterated any trace of human odor. But Kodiak wasn't relying purely on scent. He was reading the microcurrents of the water, listening for high-frequency sounds of distress that Colin's battered eardrums couldn't pick up, and operating on the almost telepathic bond he shared with his handler. They waded and swam for what felt like hours, though Colin's tactical watch told him it had only been 20 minutes. His surgically repaired shoulder screamed in agony every time he had to push a heavy submerged log out of their path. Every time Colin faltered, coughing up brackish water, Kodiak was there, nudging his handler's chin with a wet nose, urging him forward. Finally, the beam of Colin's flashlight caught the faint, pale siding of a house. It was the Gallagher residence, but it had been entirely ripped from its cinder-block foundation. The two-story structure was wedged precariously against a pair of massive ancient live oaks. The water level was already halfway up the second-floor windows. The house was groaning terribly, the wood splintering as the relentless storm surge battered it against the unyielding tree trunks. Colin swam harder, catching the edge of the submerged front porch. He hauled himself up, grabbing Kodiak's harness and pulling the dog out of the water. "Fiona, Colin bellowed, his voice immediately swallowed by the storm. He pulled his ASP tactical baton from his belt and smashed the glass of a second-story bedroom window. He hoisted himself through the shattered frame, Kodiak scrambling in right behind him. The interior of the house was a scene of total devastation. Furniture floated aimlessly in the waist-deep water that had already flooded the second floor. "Fiona Leo," Colin yelled, shining his light through the hallway. A faint, muffled scream echoed from above. The attic. Colin waded to the hallway ceiling access panel. He pushed it open, shining his light up into the cramped, sweltering space. Huddled in the corner, shivering violently, and clutching her 2 children was Fiona. Her eyes were wide, with a terror so absolute it mirrored the faces Colin had seen in war zones. Colin," she sobbed, disbelief washing over her face. How are you here?" "We're getting you out," Colin said, pulling himself up into the attic. He reached his hand down, and Kodiak leaped, scrambling up the drywall with military agility until Colin grabbed his harness and hauled him into the attic space. "The water is coming through the floorboards." Fiona panicked, clutching Maya tightly. Leo, the 7-year-old, was staring wide-eyed at the massive dog. "Listen to me," Colin said, his voice dropping into the calm, authoritative register he used during combat operations. The house isn't going to hold against those trees much longer. We have to go out the attic vent and get onto the roof. I'm going to tie us all together. Colin quickly unspooled his paracord. He fashioned hasty but secure bowline knots around Fiona and Leo. He instructed Fiona to strap Maya to her chest using a blanket. Finally, he tethered the end of the line to Kodiak's heavy-duty harness. With a brutal kick, Colin shattered the wooden louvers of the attic vent. The wind howled into the confined space, instantly extinguishing any warmth. They crawled out onto the sloping, slick asphalt shingles of the roof. The storm was at its absolute peak. Rain lashed at their faces like buckshot. Below them, the floodwaters raged, a black abyss, churning with debris. The shore was easily 50 yards away, across a channel of rapid, violent water. "We have to swim for the high ground by the road," Colin shouted. "Kodiak is going to lead Trust the dog." Before Fiona could process the terrifying instruction, an agonizing crack echoed beneath them. The roots of one of the massive oak trees holding the house in place finally gave way. The house lurched violently, tilting 20 degrees into the water. Fiona slipped. She screamed as she slid down the wet shingles, plunging over the edge and into the violent torrent below. Because she was tethered to Leo, the boy was jerked violently forward, sliding toward the drop. Colin lunged, grabbing the rope just as Leo went over the edge. The sudden weight of 2 humans dropping into the raging current nearly ripped Colin's bad shoulder out of its socket. He slammed into the gutter boots, scrabbling for purchase, on the wet roof, screaming in pain as he held onto the paracord with his one good arm. Down in the water, Fiona was struggling to keep Maya's head above the surface. The current was dragging them aggressively toward the open bay. Colin couldn't pull them up. The angle was too steep, and his strength was fading fast. That was when Kodiak moved. The Malinois didn't wait for a command. Recognizing the catastrophic failure of the line, Kodiak sprinted down the slope of the roof and launched himself into the hurricane-force winds. The dog hit the black water with a heavy splash, immediately paddling with desperate, frantic power toward Fiona. "Cody, hold!" Colin screamed over the wind. Kodiak reached Fiona just as a surge pushed her under. The Malinois clamped his titanium jaws onto the thick fabric of the blanket, wrapped around Fiona and the toddler. With the tether securely connecting Kodiak to Colin's belt, the dog essentially became an aquatic anchor. Paddling with the sheer brute strength of a military working dog, Kodiak fought the current, buying Colin the split seconds he needed. Gritting his teeth against the searing pain in his shoulder, Colin wrapped the rope around a sturdy plumbing vent pipe protruding from the roof. Using it as a pulley, he began to heave. Inch by agonizing inch, with Kodiak pushing from below and Colin pulling from above, they hauled Fiona, Maya, and Leo back toward the sloping edge of the submerged roof. When Fiona finally grabbed the gutter, Colin dragged her over the edge, followed by the children. Kodiak scrambled up last, shaking the black water from his coat, panting heavily, but never breaking eye contact with his handler. They sat shivering on the highest peak of the roof, tethered together in the dark as the house groaned beneath them. They had survived the extraction, but they were miles from safety, stranded in the middle of an angry ocean that had swallowed their town. As Colin pulled Kodiak close to share body heat, the dog whined softly, staring out into the pitch-black void of the water. Colin thought the worst was over. He had no idea that surviving the storm was only the beginning, and that the real miracle, the one that would defy all medical and scientific explanation, was waiting for them in the devastating aftermath of the morning light. The night stretched into an agonizing eternity. Perched on the apex of the Gallagher's roof, the small group was completely exposed to the wrath of Hurricane Celine. The wind tore at them with unrelenting cruelty, driving rain into their skin like icy needles. Colin had positioned his body as a human shield against the prevailing gale, wrapping his uninjured arm around Fiona and the children, while Kodiak curled into a tight, muscular ball at their feet, radiating what little body heat he had left. By 2 a.m., the temperature had plummeted. Hypothermia was no longer a threat. It was a creeping reality. Maya had stopped crying hours ago, her small body shivering violently against Fiona's chest. Leo was completely unresponsive, staring blankly into the dark. Colin knew from brutal experience that apathy was the final stage before the body simply gave up. "Keep him talking, Fiona," Colin shouted, his voice hoarse and raw. "Do not let him fall asleep. Do you hear me?" Fiona nodded weakly, her lips a bruised shade of blue. "Leo, baby, tell me about your favorite truck, the big red one." As Fiona tried to coax words from her son, Colin felt a sudden sharp movement against his boots. Kodiak stood up. The Malinois' ears were flat against his skull, and his nose was pointed toward the churning black water to their left. He let out a low, vibrating growl that Colin felt in his chest. Something was coming. Colin flicked his tactical flashlight on. The beam sliced through the driving rain and illuminated a nightmare. A massive uprooted pine tree, easily 80 feet long and weighing several tons, was barreling down the flood channel, propelled by a sudden surge in the current. It was acting as a battering ram, and it was aimed directly at the weakened structural supports of the Gallagher's submerged first floor. "Brace!" Colin roared, grabbing the paracord tether and pulling it taut. The impact sounded like a bomb detonating. The entire house shuddered violently, throwing them sideways. Shingles ripped away beneath them. The structural integrity of the roof, already compromised by the oak trees, finally failed. With a sickening groan of snapping timber, the roof split right down the middle. They were sliding. "Hold on to the rope!" Colin screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the collapsing house. The right side of the roof completely gave way, plunging into the violent floodwaters. Colin, Fiona, and the children were violently yanked downward, sliding off the remaining apex and dropping into the freezing, turbulent surge. The water closed over Colin's head. It was a chaotic, tumbling darkness. Debris struck his legs and torso. He felt the paracord burn through his palms as the current tried to rip Fiona and the kids away from him. He fought toward the surface, his lungs burning his bad shoulder, screaming in pure agony as he kicked upward. He broke the surface, gasping for air. "Fiona, here!" She choked out, thrashing a few yards away, keeping Maya's head elevated, while Leo clung desperately to her back. The tether was still holding, but they were being swept rapidly away from the wreckage of the house, out toward the open, treacherous waters of the bay. "We have to swim to the pines," Colin yelled, pointing toward a stand of ancient, deeply rooted cypress trees about 50 yards downstream. If they got swept past those trees, there was nothing but the open Atlantic Ocean. But Colin was failing. The physical toll of the rescue, combined with the freezing water and the agonizing pain of his titanium-plated shoulder, had drained his reserves. He tried to swim, but his left arm was completely dead, hanging uselessly at his side. The current was too strong. They were drifting too fast. Then Colin felt a powerful tug on his belt. Kodiak. The Malinois had surfaced beside him. But as Colin flashed his light on the dog, his heart dropped. The right side of Kodiak's face was covered in a thick, dark mixture of blood and water. A piece of the shattered roof had struck the dog during the collapse, leaving a deep gash above his eye. "Cody, no." Colin gasped, reaching for the harness. "Save yourself, buddy. Break away." It was a command Colin had never given the ultimate release of a working dog to preserve its own life. Kodiak ignored it. The dog's amber eyes found Colin's, and for a split second, the storm seemed to fade. The Malinois clamped his jaws onto the heavy fabric of Colin's tactical vest near the collarbone. With a guttural growl that defied the roaring wind, Kodiak began to swim. The strength of a Belgian Malinois is legendary in military circles, but what Kodiak did next defied simple biology. Towing a fully grown, waterlogged Navy SEAL, who was in turn tethered to a mother and 2 children, the 70-pound dog fought the hurricane current. Every muscle in Kodiak's body strained against the surging tide. He didn't swim frantically. He swam with a measured, rhythmic power, angling their drift toward the massive trunks of the cypress trees. Colin kicked with his remaining strength, trying to ease the burden, but the dog was doing the impossible. Slowly, agonizingly, they broke out of the main channel's dead center flow. "Almost there," Fiona screamed, coughing up brackish water. With a final desperate surge, Kodiak dragged them into the flooded canopy of the cypress grove. Colin slammed into a thick, rough trunk and immediately wrapped his good arm around it, locking his legs to anchor himself. He hauled the tether in, pulling Fiona, Leo, and Maya into the dense protective cage of the tree's massive roots. Kodiak let go of Colin's vest, immediately crawling up onto a large V-shaped crotch in the tree branches, exhausted and bleeding. Colin pulled the family up right behind him. They wedged themselves into the thick branches, relatively safe from the worst of the current, completely shielded by the ancient wood. As dawn slowly began to break, painting the bruised sky in dull shades of slate and grey, the winds finally began to die down. The hurricane was moving north. Colin leaned his head back against the bark, completely spent. He looked up at Kodiak. The dog was lying still, his breathing shallow and erratic. The gash on his head looked severe, and his eyes were closed. "Hang in there, buddy," Colin whispered, his voice cracking. "You did it. Just hold on." 2 hours later, the rhythmic, heavy thumping of a Coast Guard Jayhawk helicopter echoed over the floodwaters. A rescue basket was lowered through the trees. When the rescue swimmer dropped down, he found a battered Navy SEAL, a freezing mother and her 2 children, and a motionless, bleeding Malinois. "We need a medevac for the dog right now," Colin demanded, refusing the basket until the swimmer strapped Kodiak in first. As the basket lifted Kodiak into the sky, Colin felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The dog hadn't moved. The triage center at the Charleston Naval Base was a chaotic hive of activity. Cots lined the gymnasium floor, flooded with survivors, medics, and emergency personnel. Fiona and her children had been immediately whisked away to the pediatric ward. They were suffering from severe hypothermia and exhaustion, but they were alive. Colin sat on a rigid plastic chair in the veterinary surgical wing of the base, staring blankly at the floor. He had refused medical treatment for his shoulder, demanding to stay near the surgical suite where Dr. Benjamin Caldwell, the base's chief veterinary surgeon, was operating on Kodiak. It had been 4 hours. The silence from the operating room was deafening. Colin replayed the night over and over. He had asked too much of the dog. Kodiak had taken a catastrophic blow to the head-swallowed gallons of toxic floodwater and exerted a level of physical force that should have stopped his heart. Finally, the swinging doors pushed open. Dr. Caldwell stepped out. The surgeon looked exhausted, still wearing his blood-stained scrubs, pulling his surgical cap off his head. Colin stood up instantly, his legs shaking. "Doc," Caldwell let out a long, heavy breath and offered a tight, reassuring smile. "He's alive, Colin. He's stable." We stopped the bleeding, cleared his lungs, and managed to stabilize his core temperature. Colin dropped back into the chair, burying his face in his hands as a wave of overwhelming relief washed over him. "Thank God. The debris hit him so hard, Doc. I thought he was gone." Caldwell pulled up a chair across from Colin, his expression shifting from relief to utter bewilderment. "Colin, I need to talk to you about that head injury, because what I found when I examined Kodiak, it doesn't make any medical sense." Colin looked up, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean? Is there brain damage?" "No," Caldwell said softly. "But the blunt force trauma from whatever hit him on that roof was catastrophic to his orbital bones. It caused an immediate severe detachment of both retinas, coupled with massive swelling around the optic nerves." Colin stared at the doctor, struggling to process the words. "Okay. Can you fix it? Will his vision recover?" Dr. Caldwell leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Colin, you're not understanding me. Based on the coagulation of the blood and the tissue damage, that injury happened hours before you made that final swim. The moment the house collapsed and you went into the water, Kodiak's retinas detached. The sterile fluorescent lights of the hallway seemed to hum louder. Colin felt a cold chill run down his spine as the realization hit him. "Wait," Colin whispered. "Are you telling me?" "Yes," Caldwell said, his voice thick with awe. "When Kodiak dove into that raging current, grabbed your vest and navigated around submerged debris, wrecked cars and massive floating trees, he couldn't see a single thing. He was completely 100% blind." Colin sat frozen in stunned silence. Navigating a hurricane surge is impossible for a human with perfect vision. To do it blind while towing 300 pounds of human weight defied every known law of physics, biology, and canine capability. Kodiak hadn't been swimming by sight. He had navigated the deadly chaotic maze of the floodwaters using only the scent of Colin's gear, the micro-vibrations of the water currents, and a bond with his handler so profound that it bordered on the supernatural. "That's not even the strangest part," a new voice interrupted. Colin turned to see Captain Gregory Norton, the base's chief medical officer, walking down the hall holding a digital tablet. Norton stopped next to Caldwell, looking down at Colin with an expression of disbelief. "I saw you refused triage, Chief," Norton said. "So I pulled your recent medical charts from the VA to see what we were dealing with regarding that shoulder of yours. The records from last month state that the shrapnel damage to your brachial plexus nerve was permanent. They had you marked for a medical discharge next week due to a 70% loss of motor function and severe muscle atrophy in your left arm." Colin frowned instinctively, flexing his left hand. "Yeah, it's been dead for 6 months. I couldn't even lift a coffee cup." "Right," Norton said, tapping the tablet. "So do you want to explain to me how you're currently clenching your left fist with enough force to crack your knuckles?" Colin looked down at his left hand. He opened his fingers. He closed them into a tight fist. He lifted his arm, rotating his shoulder. There was pain, yes, a deep, burning ache, but the numbness was completely gone. The agonizing paralysis that had ended his career had vanished. "When I was in the water," Colin murmured, staring at his moving fingers. "When Kodiak grabbed me, I thought I was going to die. I stopped fighting, but then I felt him pulling. I knew if I didn't help him, the current would kill him too. I grabbed the tree root with my left arm. I had to." Norton shook his head in slow amazement. "In extreme life-or-death survival situations, we've seen cases of hysterical strength. A massive, sustained dump of adrenaline and cortisol can sometimes force the brain to bypass damaged neural pathways to keep the host alive. It's called spontaneous neural plasticity. But for it to fully reactivate a dormant nerve cluster like yours, it's a 1 in a million medical anomaly." Colin looked through the small glass window of the surgical suite. Inside, lying on a stainless steel table, wrapped in heated blankets, was his dog. The blind warrior who had refused to let his handler die in the dark. In saving Colin, Kodiak had forced Colin's brain to literally rewire itself. A month later, the sun shone brightly over a rebuilt Cooper's Point. Colin stood on the edge of the newly repaired road, throwing a heavy rubber Kong toy into the tall marsh grass. Kodiak, his eyes slightly clouded, but his spirit unbroken, sprinted after it. While his sight would never fully return to 100%, Caldwell's surgeries had restored enough vision for him to track movement, and his other senses had sharpened into a lethal precision. Colin's left arm was fully functional. The medical board had reviewed his case, classified his recovery as an unexplained medical marvel, and reinstated his active duty status. But Colin had respectfully declined. He had fought his wars overseas, and he had fought his final battle in the black waters of South Carolina. Fiona, Leo, and Maya walked up the road carrying a picnic basket. Leo ran immediately to Kodiak, wrapping his arms around the dog's thick neck. The formidable Belgian Malinois, a weapon of war forged in the mountains of Afghanistan, simply wagged his tail and leaned into the boy's embrace. Sometimes miracles don't come from the heavens. Sometimes they are pulled from the darkest, deadliest waters by a loyal friend who simply refuses to let you sink. If this incredible true story of loyalty survival and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog touched your heart, please drop a like and leave a comment below. Don't forget to hit that share button to spread this amazing miracle with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable real-life stories every week.